Thank you all for... Can you hear okay? Yeah. All the microphones working here. Good. Thank you all for coming out this morning, and looking forward to another day of fine presentations. Yesterday we had 4 very good lectures, and I think we'll do just as well today. What I want to do this morning is to show you some images of James Monroe and use them to tell you something about his life and his legacy. That is, I'm going to use the images not only to illustrate something about his life, but to show how artists over the years portrayed him. This presents his legacy in 2 ways. First, it shows how artists who painted him from life viewed him and his place in the life of the nation at the time. And that is what his living legacy was. And second, to show how later artists portrayed him and what they saw as his historical legacy. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the images, how he was portrayed, but I also want to say something about the images themselves. My work as editor of the Monroe paper, I work with the written word. Documents, as we've heard. There's not just letters, diaries, the written word on paper, but as we've heard, there are historic sites that are important to the documentary editing, to the documentary record. As we'll hear later this morning, there are objects and artifacts, there are images, and as we heard, there is also their sound. So there's all these different ways to document the past. It can take many, many forms. And in talking about images, what I want to point out not only is the value of them, but as with all documentation, the limits as well. These range from who creates the documents, the level of the skill or understanding of the creator, who is interpreting the document and how it's used, and even the limitations of an incomplete documentary record. In looking at the events of a person's life, the normal approach is to do it chronologically, starting with the subject's youth and progressing on through adulthood and old age. If we do this with James Monroe, immediately we run into the limitations of the visual documentary record. The first limitation, which is not unusual for someone from Monroe's era, is that we have no images of him as a youth. We don't have baby pictures or first grade pictures, those sorts of things. The earliest images we have of him is as a young man. This is a painting by artist Joseph Castell. It shows Monroe as he would have looked in the 1780s when he was beginning his political career, probably about the time he was in the Continental Congress. It's not a life portrait. It was painted in 1818 when he was president. He was 60 years old when this painting was made. But right away, we're into legacy. The portraits suggest that there was an interest in Monroe beyond just what he was doing in the present, beyond his words and actions, but also his appearance. Yeah, this artist was trying to conceptualize what the President of the United States would have looked like as a young man. So here's his idea of it. Okay? Here's another picture of a young James Monroe. Again, a young man, probably in his 20s, which would have been about the 1780s. Portrait's been used a lot. It's on the cover of the published version of Monroe's autobiography that was published a number of years ago. Problem is, the clothing is all wrong. This is not 1780s clothing. This is 1820s clothing. So the current thought is this really isn't James Monroe. It's not a retrospective painting like the Castell. I mean, it's clearly a life portrait of someone, and most likely candidate, given the age of the person and the resemblance, is it's probably one of Monroe's nephews, either his closest nephew, who was named James as well and was known as James Monroe Jr., or perhaps James's brother Augustine, both of whom were the sons
of Monroe's brother, Andrew. Okay. Now, so there's two commonly seen portraits of Monroe as a young man that are not current. So are there any from the earlier years of his life? There's a different way to get into this. This we've seen these pictures yesterday. On the left is Elizabeth Monroe, James Monroe's wife, and on the right is his young daughter, Eliza. These were both painted in Paris. The portrait of Eliza was painted in June 1796, just about the time of her 28th birthday, very close to it. So it may have been a birthday portrait. And likewise, Eliza was painted in November 1794, about the time of her 8th birthday. So these may have both been done as birthday portraits. And we have these well documented. Monroe's account book for his years in Paris have entries for paying for these portraits. So that's how we know when they were done. Now, it seems like if they're in Paris and they're having their portraits made and Mrs. Monroe is done, Eliza is done, it seems like Monroe would have been painted as well at the time. And we have this painting by the same artist, Louis Senet, who did the portrait of Mrs. Monroe. And again, assumed to be James Monroe, since it's from the same era by the same artist. The problem is, to me, this looks nothing like anything we have of James Monroe. The face is much fuller, the hair is longer, and Monroe was 38 at the time, and this person is obviously much, much younger than that. My sense on this is, again, this isn't not James Monroe, but I think it's his young cousin, Joseph Jones Jr., who was in Paris with them at the time. And there's a family resemblance, so I think it's somebody in the family, but I'm pretty sure it's not him. So my guess is that it's young Joseph. So portraits that for years were thought to be James Monroe that probably were not. We really don't have any reliable portraits of Monroe as a young man. But like Castell, artists were interested in Monroe in his youth, the events of his youth, and so he shows up not just in portraits, but in historical paintings. And here's everybody's favorite that we have seen several times, which when Brooke was talking about it yesterday, he fumbled and started to say Monroe crossing the Delaware, and then he corrected himself, but he was right the first time. You know, this is Monroe crossing the Delaware. And as we've heard several times, the figure, the figure here holding the flag is supposed to represent James Monroe. You want legacy, here you got it in spades. So the great iconic painting of the American Revolution, this and probably Trumbull's signing of the Declaration of Independence are the two most known paintings from that era. But if you look at this figure that is to be Monroe, look at Washington and look at it, it's exactly the same pose. It's almost a mirror reflection. So not only is Monroe right there with General Washington, but he's in pretty much the same pose, and he's holding the flag. And sort of how much more iconic can you get on this? Everybody talks about this painting. My sense is the Coast Guard uses this painting in training sessions for what not to do in a boat. Between George standing up here with his foot on the rail, and you got the horses back over here jumping around in the boat, and the boats are overloaded, and anyway. But it's such a fun painting. But it really is this icon that everybody. It's on the New Jersey State Quarter that they did a while back again. Anyway, it's totally inaccurate. Monroe did not cross the Delaware with Washington. He was at the crossing, he was at the Battle of Trenton, but he was with the advance guard. Monroe had crossed the night before. They secured the roads into Trenton for the army to advance, and when the attack was made, the company that Monroe was with led the charge, The Hessians who were stationed at Trenton were well-trained, good soldiers, and they immediately started setting up defensive positions, including setting up cannon in the main street to block Washington's advance. The advance company charged forward, captured the cannon, but in the process, both William Washington, the captain of the company, and Monroe, who was the lieutenant, were both wounded in the charge. So, not only was James Monroe, the president, a veteran of the Revolutionary Army like George Washington, he was a wounded veteran. You want legacy, wounded veteran becomes president of the United States. Everybody knew about this. I've tried to track down how they know that, how people at the time knew Monroe had been wounded at Trenton. And I think it was just simply people who were at the battle, who were in the Army, talked about it and knew about it. But it shows up very, very early in his career, references to him having been wounded at Trenton. In the scene here, and I did this in black and white because it shows up a little better than the actual color painting. This was done by John Trumbull, and he did a whole series of Revolutionary War paintings. He did 8 of them, starting with the signing of the Declaration of Independence and then going forward. And he did this of Washington's victory at Trenton, and the figure standing there who appears to be wounded is the Hessian commander who is surrendering. But in the background here, you have a wounded soldier on the ground holding onto his shoulder. That's young Lieutenant James Monroe, wounded on the field of battle. This was painted in 1796 when Monroe was in the Senate. So very early in his life, he was showing up in the visual historical record. If you look at these up close, Trumbull was not very good at painting young people. Everybody looks like they're 50 years old. And this is obvious in this next scene from Trumbull. Also, this is the last of the series of the Revolutionary paintings of the resignation of General Washington to the Continental Congress. And sitting here in the crowd is a familiar, where'd he go? Here he is, a familiar red-headed figure, Thomas Jefferson. Sitting next to him on his right is what is supposed to be a young congressman new to the Continental Congress, James Monroe. Somebody mentioned yesterday that he's like Zelig or Forrest Gump or whatever. He always is showing up in the picture. So here he is very early in his career at this, again, iconic moment of General Washington surrendering his command. A couple of weeks after this, Monroe voted to sign the Treaty of Paris, to ratify the Treaty of Paris in 1783, ending the Revolutionary War and securing American independence. So again, he's right there on the site. But you look at this and you think, this old man is supposed to be 25 years old. But it's the limitations of the artist. It's interesting, though, that the two figures, Mrs. Washington and the granddaughters back here are, of course, a little bit recognizable. Actually, Mrs. Washington's up in the balcony. But it's interesting. The two that are really recognizable, of course, is General Washington, but then Thomas Jefferson as well stands out as a recognizable figure. Okay? Finally, we get to an actual portrait of James Monroe. This was painted in 1810, probably. Monroe was back from a 5-year tour of diplomatic duties in Europe. He had been once again elected governor of Virginia, and in several short months after this, he was appointed as Secretary of State of the United States. So this is the point where he was really rising to national prominence. And outside of portraits painted for the family like the ones of Mrs. Monroe or Eliza, it makes sense that this then gets painted because he was becoming a major national figure at this point. Then a couple years later, we get into one of the more recognizable paintings. This is by John Vanderlyn. It was painted in Washington in 1816, just months before Monroe became president. Vanderlyn may have painted a portrait of Monroe in England in 1803, 1804. There's sort of a vague reference in the correspondence. It's not really clear whether he did or not. It doesn't survive, we don't have, but possibly there may have been an earlier portrait. This is Monroe really at the pinnacle of his power and career, just before he had just completed 6 years as Secretary of State and was on the verge of becoming the president. Over the next, next, 15 years or so, 16 years, 23 portraits. Monroe was portrayed 23 different times, so he really hit a heyday of portraiture for him. Now, getting into portraits, there is always a bit of a problem that's a little bit of a kicker. Here on the left is the Vanderlyn portrait painted in 1816. On the right is a portrait by Gilbert Stuart painted about 8 months later in 1817. Are these the same guy? Again, you run in, and when we were doing the illustrated history, I was thinking about this because we were looking up portraits of Monroe and his associates, and you would get these pictures, and it was, well, the caption says this who it is, so we guess it is. But as I've noted here, you get portraits that are supposed to be somebody, and maybe it's not. A lot of portraits are fairly well identified, so you do get a pretty good sense. I mean, we know this is the Vanderlyn portrait of James Monroe, and we know this is Stuart's portrait. But you take a lot of it on faith a lot of times on these portraits. In fact, there was a portrait of Monroe from about the same time as the Vanderlyn by a man named James Frothingham. I think that's right. That the museum owned, and several years ago the curator was looking at it and started looking at it closely, and it turned out it wasn't an original portrait. It was something that had been painted over of where a portrait of somebody else had been modified to supposedly look like James Monroe. So it was entirely a spurious portrait. So you really take a bit of a chance with these, but a lot of them tend to be reliable. Okay? So we bump into this. You have two portraits painted close together. They don't look alike. So the then question comes up, well, what did James Monroe actually look like? Probably like this. This was the favorite portrait. This was painted in 1822 in Washington by Samuel Morse, who later became famous for inventing the telegraph. At the time, and the painting had been commissioned by the city of Charleston. Morris painted a full-length painting, and the family liked it so much that he did this bust for them. And this is in the Blue Room at the White House, the original painting of this. Morris wrote to his father about painting this, and he said that the family all say that mine is the best that has been taken. His daughter told me that her father was delighted with it and said it was the only one in his opinion that looked like him. And he then went on to note, and he said this with the steward in the room. So if we go by what the family says, what Monroe says, this is probably the closest image of him that we have. Who knows who this is? Who knows who it is? How many of you ever actually saw President Kennedy live and in the, a couple, all right? Today, with our saturation of images through television, through pictures in newspapers, magazines, through the internet, we know what a lot of people look like who we have never seen. We know what things look like that we have never seen. I've never been to Egypt. I've never seen the pyramids. I know what they look like. I've seen thousands of images of them. In Monroe's era, this wasn't the case. We look at all these portraits of Monroe. People at the time, very few people saw them. The artists would exhibit them, so if somebody was in Philadelphia or Washington or Boston, they maybe would see them, but they never saw the portraits. Furthermore, they never saw the man. The president never traveled around much. Most people didn't know what the president looked like. If presidents saw anything, they saw engravings. This was made in December 1817, shortly after Monroe became president. It's the first engraving that was made of Monroe. But people really didn't see this very much either because it was engraved, it was put in a book, but they were expensive. A lot of people couldn't afford to buy them. So a few wealthy individuals saw them, their friends saw them, but by and large, the public wouldn't see these. The moral of the story is the vast, vast majority of Americans at the time James Monroe was president had no idea what he looked like. He traveled around the country, and as was mentioned yesterday, people came out by the thousands because it was an opportunity to see the president, to hear him speak. Thomas Jefferson, during his presidency, gave 2 speeches. James Madison, 3. They never traveled, you never saw them. Monroe went on a tour, and it was this huge event because the president was coming to town. We could actually see the president. We could hear him talk. This is an idea that seems so foreign to us, that somebody runs the country and you have no idea what he even looks like. Okay? So, we'll get onto this a little bit more later. Okay? This is the portrait that the engraving was based on. In fact, the artist Charles King had been commissioned to make this portrait so that the print could be made from it. This was painted in the White House in 1817. This portrait hangs in the courthouse in Leesburg. And it's got a very flat finish on it, and it's not because the photograph is so bad. For some reason, the sheen has worn off the portrait. And this is what it looks like. It almost looks like it's drawn with crayons when you look at the real thing. Anyway, this is a standard sort of portrait, full-length portrait from the era. And it's full of iconography. Here you have this distinguished-looking man. He's sitting in this very nice chair. He's holding a document. In the back, in the background here is the Capitol up on the hill. You have the column. You have this very nice table. You have this portrayal of a man of dignity, of power, of importance, with symbols not just of his personal power and authority, but of the nation. You have the Capitol up on the hill in the background. Here's another portrait painted a little bit later. This is Rembrandt Peale, and this is owned by the James Monroe Museum. And you can see it's almost exactly the same pose. He's holding a document just the same. He's seated. Again, the Capitol is up here on the hill, being viewed out past the column. It's a lot of the same sort of imagery. Then a third one. This is again a Gilbert Stuart. Based upon the bust that we saw earlier, and it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. He's seated in the chair of state. There's the books in the background. He has the papers and the ink, and he's very dignified and very serious. This is such a standard pose for portraiture at this time. I was in Edinburgh last summer and went to the National Gallery there. And I tried hard to find the image that was there, and I couldn't get a copy of it. They didn't have a copy at the museum. I haven't been able to find one anywhere. But it's of some Scottish dignitary. And I looked at it and I thought, man, I've seen this painting before. It's almost exactly the same pose. There's the red drape. He was in a red chair. He had the red tablecloth. There was the landscape in the background. So it's a very, very standard form of portraiture for a figure of importance to illustrate the nature of their authority, of their power, of their grandeur. Then, in addition to these sitting sort of portraits, we have standing ones. And the standing ones get into the iconography even more. This one is, again, it's by John Vanderlyn, painted in 1822. And this one is really loaded with iconography. You not only have sort of the chair of state over here on the side, and we have the corner of, it's not the Capitol in this time, it's the corner of, it's not really clear. It might be the corner of the Capitol, it might be the corner of the President's house. But what's of really great significance is, here under his right hand is a map of Florida. Monroe, from 1803 on, had been trying to acquire Florida, both what we think of as the current state of Florida and on across the Gulf Coast over to New Orleans, which was called West Florida, from the Spanish. Had been going on and on. The Spanish didn't want to sell it. They resisted. Finally, with the 1819 treaty between the United States and Spain, Spain finally sold Florida to the United States. But the Spanish king didn't ratify it until late 1821. So this painting is 1822. Here's Monroe standing here with the map of Florida. He's got his hand on it. He's got his sword laying across it. The message is clear. We've got Florida, and it is finally ours. And then you get into the other sort of standard iconography in the background. You have this very ornate tablecloth, and again, you have the law books and the Constitution in the background, and you have the papers and the pen, and you have the drape, and all these sorts of things. I should say something about clothing very quickly in this. We have a friend who is a clothing conservator and studies historic clothing. I was talking to her about this actually just a couple of weeks ago. And she said, in paintings like this, the artist tended to clothe the subject in older style clothing. That was just a little bit out of date and a little bit more conservative. And she said, this tended to add gravitas to the figure, that people who would see the portrait would be familiar with this older style of clothing and would be able to identify it with the subject. It's sort of like seeing a picture of somebody dressed maybe in a tuxedo. It's a little bit formal, it's a little bit old style, but it conveys this sense of formality. This is the portrait painted by Morse that was commissioned by the city of St. Louis. It's the Vanderlyn was commissioned by the city of New York, and it hangs in City Hall in New York. This one was commissioned by the city of Charleston, and it hangs in City Hall in Charleston. This one is very loaded with iconography as well. And Morse commented a couple times that President Monroe would be out riding, he would be someplace, and he would come in, and he would then pose to be painting. And again, so we get into the standard iconography. Here's, again, this chair of state, and here's the White House out through the back. We have an arch, rather than a column, we have an arch up here at the top. Again, you have the book open, the law books. But in this one, look at his clothing. His clothing is very different. He has on just sort of a long, sort of plain coat. He's wearing riding boots. He's got a sword at his hip, and he's holding an old tricorner hat. Monroe dressed like this a lot, and he did it on purpose because it harkened back to the days of the Revolution and his service as an officer in the Continental Army. As was mentioned yesterday, Monroe put great stock on his service in the Revolution and on the Revolution as one of the great events of not just American history, but world history. In his view, it was a world-changing event. He also saw it as a great symbol for the nation. Monroe, as much as he believed in anything, he believed in the importance of the Union of the States. He thought that the United States could not survive without it being this continental union. And one way he tried to convey this to the American people was by using the American Revolution as a symbol of the nation, that it was an event that all Americans could relate to as part of their heritage. Even though there were a lot of immigrants who weren't in the country at the time of the Revolution, even though there were a lot of people in the country, in the Americas at the time who didn't support the Revolution, it really wasn't a common heritage, but it was something that was seen as a common heritage. So he hearkened back to it, and he wore this costume that somewhat resembled a Continental Army uniform. And in fact, when Lafayette visited the United States in 1824, when he came to the president's house to be received, Monroe was there with the cabinet. Monroe had all the cabinet members wear riding boots, buff-colored vests, and blue jackets to have, again, this symbol of the Revolution, meeting, greeting, welcoming, another great symbol of the American Revolution. And this was something that was noticed. When Monroe was on his tour, when he was in New Haven, Connecticut, the newspaper editor wrote about his visit. He said, "The dress of the president has been deservedly noticed in other papers for its neatness and Republican simplicity. He wore a plain blue coat, buff underdress, and a hat and cockade of the Revolutionary fashion. It comported with his rank, was adopted to the occasion, and well calculated to excite in the minds of the people the remembrance of the days that tried men's souls." It's the President of the United States as a living legacy of the American Revolution, and it was something that was done purposefully. Okay? Now, in addition to just portraits, there was an interest in portraying events of Monroe's life, both while he was living and then later, of course. I mean, you know, the painting of the two Trentons, of crossing the Delaware and Washington's victory, one during his life, one later. There's some other examples of this as well. This is an image we saw yesterday of the Indian dance from the Pawnee delegation visiting Washington. This was painted by Madame Hyde de Neuville, who was the wife of the French ambassador. So it's a painting by somebody who was actually at the event. And you can't see it very well in the copies, but if you look at the original, up here in the middle, Madame Hyde de Neuville had sketched in figures sitting in chairs watching the event. And in the middle is a man sitting in a chair of state. It's President Monroe sitting in the background watching this event. Okay. Related to this is and gets us to another image. The United States government had this practice of when Indian delegations visited or when there were treaty negotiations, members of the tribes would be presented with what were called peace medals that bore the image of the president. So here's the Monroe Peace Medal, and here is, on the left is a portrait of a Pawnee named Pushmataha, who is wearing his presidential medal that he received from when he visited Washington. Now, we get artistic license here in that the medal is, as you can see, the image is reversed. And I did checking on this. I was looking at all the medals. I thought, well, you know, sort of maybe this isn't a Monroe medal, but you know, sort of they're either facing to the right, or the images are very different. So it just, the artist just didn't take a lot of time and a lot of detail to sketch the medal. But given who the figure is, and given that he's wearing a medal, it's clearly it's the Monroe medal. This was painted by Charles Bird King, who did that earlier seated portrait. And King was one of the early painters known for doing Indian portraits. Another painter from the time known for doing Indian portraits was George Catlin, and he did this group portrait. It's not a meeting of the Munchkins. It's a portrait of the delegates at the 1829 Virginia Convention for considering revising the state constitution. And the figure we have here in the middle addressing the group is former President James Madison. Sitting over here behind him is Chief Justice John Marshall, and sitting in the chair, the president of the convention, is James Monroe. So here it is, 1829. You have the leading political figures of Virginia, and prominent among them are the three greatest Virginians of the day: Monroe, Madison, and Marshall. Again, it's living legacy. Here they are. Here are our great leaders involved in the important business of revising the state constitution. Now, this is basically it's a group portrait, and rather than standing in a line and getting photographed, as was happening today, they're sitting around and they get painted. But it gets to be a bit of a problem with painting these sorts of things. You're painting the Battle of Trenton, you're painting crossing the Delaware, they're action paintings, you can do lots of things with action. But what do you want to do if you want to portray the Monroe Doctrine? You can have this painting, and this is from a mural in the Capitol in Washington. And so you have President Monroe sitting at the table, and you have Secretary of Adams looking at the globe, and you have the other members of the cabinet sitting there. And they could really be doing anything, but there's a caption underneath it that says Monroe Doctrine, so you assume it's a cabinet meeting discussing them. There's really not a lot of way to portray any kind of action here. Or, likewise, here is another mural from the Capitol, and this is for the Louisiana Purchase. And we have Monroe here as an American minister. Next to him is Robert R. Livingston, the other minister. And standing up is Francois Barbé Marbois, who was the French Secretary of the Treasury, who was the French commissioner. And you can tell he's French because he's dressed much better than the Americans are. But this has fairly good iconography. He's pointing at a map of Louisiana. You have a map of Spain up here in the background. You have a globe. But again, there's not much going on in this. And again, there's a caption telling you what it is, so you know. Are there other ways to do this? Well, there are. And that is through sculpture, through doing it in 3D, if you will. This is, again, it's a monument to the signing of the Louisiana Treaty, and Livingston is sitting here, Monroe standing in the background, and Marbois is this figure here. This was made actually for the 1904 Louisiana Purchase International Exposition, the St. Louis Fair of 1904. And it's a monument by a sculptor named Carl Bitter. It was one of the centerpieces of the fair. And the bronze cast was taken from St. Louis, and it's now on the grounds of the Missouri State Capitol in Columbia. And incidentally, the plaster cast of this, the cast that Bitter made for sculpting this, for casting in bronze, belongs to, guess who? It belongs to the University of Mary Washington. It's part of the university. It's part of the museum's collection. It's currently in George Washington Hall, but I understand that it's going to be moved for display in the museum as well. The plaster cast is much smaller than this, but again, we have a direct link to it. Here is a statue by Felix de Weldon that relates back to the Monroe Doctrine. It shows Monroe standing with his hand on a globe pointing to South America. Now, when you get into these things, as with all sorts of portraiture, context gets to be very important. This, incidentally, belongs to the museum as well, a short plaster, it's a bronze casting. This was conceived, it's by an artist named Felix de Weldon, and it was conceived for a monument to Monroe that would be in Washington, D.C. It was never executed, so all that we have is this small bronze casting that de Weldon made. But you can imagine you would have more context. I mean, sort of think of the Jefferson statue in the Jefferson Memorial, or the Lincoln statue in the Lincoln Memorial by the great American sculptor Daniel Chester French, and of the iconic greatness of those in that setting. So imagine this sort of statue in a more heroic setting. It would again convey this sense of legacy and importance to the nation. Then again, another one. This is a statue of Monroe by Italian-American sculptor Attilio Piccirilli. This is on the grounds of Ashland, our friends over in Albemarle County. Again, it's out of context. This statue was commissioned by the government of Venezuela. It was to stand in the main plaza in Caracas. There was a revolution in Venezuela before the statue could be delivered and erected. It sat in a warehouse for years and years and years. J. Johns, an earlier owner of Ashland, who started running the house as a museum, purchased the statue and had it placed on the grounds at Ashland. You know, it's a wonderful it's a wonderful statue, a wonderful monument, and it looks very nice where it's displayed at Ashland. But again, think of it as being in the main plaza of a South American capital, a monument to an American president being honored for what the people of Venezuela saw as Monroe's legacy to them. Okay. Of course, in doing these things in biography, you end up with death. And here we have a rather gruesome practice that went on, a death mask. After Monroe died in 1831 in New York, a man came in and made a plaster cast of his face. And most death masks look all pretty much the same. I mean, they're not very distinctive. You think, well, sort of this is the way he looked. Well, a little bit, but they really don't portray very much other than they are what they are. Monroe died in New York at the home of his daughter. Gigantic state funeral. Thousands of people lined the streets of New York for Monroe's funeral. He was buried in a cemetery in a crypt there. But in 1858, the 100th anniversary of Monroe's birth, the state of Virginia decided that they were going to exhume the remains and have them returned to Virginia and be buried again in Richmond. A huge, marvelous ceremony took place, and this gets us back into the technology of portraying events. I mean, so it gets to Monroe's legacy. This is from a publication called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper from the 1850s. Leslie's was one of the great newspapers of the era and widely circulated. Lots of people saw it. But what's interesting about this is by the 1850s, printing technology has gotten to the point where there can be mass production of images. So you go back to the 1818 portrait of Monroe sitting in a chair that was printed and put in books that a few people saw. This went into a newspaper that had national, international circulation. Thousands and thousands of people could see these images. And it was really the revolution in mass production portrayal of images. And it reflects on, again, the view of Monroe's legacy at the time, that Leslie gave 2 full pages with 4 images of the ceremony. So we start out with, here's the exhumation at the gravesite in New York. Here's the coffin lying in State and City Hall in New York. Here's the coffin being taken off the steamboat in Richmond. Here's the hearse ready to carry it. And then here's the ceremony at the cemetery for the reburial. Okay. I don't know if you know, very quickly, I'll throw this in. I don't know if you know very much about this kind of engraving. I am in awe. First of all, we don't even know who did this. So the engraver is completely, you have this wonderful work of art and the artist is not known. But I don't know how much you know about making these sorts of engravings, but they're made from etchings. So what the artist has to do is he has to put acid on a sheet of metal, take a stylus and engrave this into the metal to be printed. And because it's being printed, he has to do it backwards. So he sketches the original thing, and then he sits down and very meticulously redoes the whole thing, scraping it in the metal backwards. I find this truly, truly amazing, since I have a hard time drawing a straight line. So anyway, but it really portrays the revolution in technology that allows the dissemination of images to change. Okay? Then finally, we come back to our own bust of James Monroe. This is in the garden at the Monroe Museum. It was created, commissioned by the museum for portrayal there. And, perhaps this is the best, sort of overall image for Monroe's legacy to us today. A man of, just sort of very, very simple dignity. And if you want to see this, there's two copies of this actually here. One is in the garden at the museum. The other is upstairs in the foyer. So sometime today, walk up into the center of James Monroe Hall, and you can see this fine bust of President Monroe. Incidentally, made by Margaret French Cresson, the daughter of the great American sculptor Daniel Chester French. So thank you all very much. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes here. Yeah, Jim.
Where is the death mask today? That could be used as a basis for forensic recreation.
Scott asked me this earlier, and it's at an art museum upstate New York, and I don't really, off the top of my head, I've not been able to recall where it. I mean, I have it written down, I know, but that's where it is. It's in an art museum, someplace upstate New York.
But just as at the Mount Vernon Museum, they've done forensic recreations of Washington at various times in his life. Here you could have the measurements to
Yes.
see that.
Yeah, and use that and use portraits, and certainly, yes, yeah, it very much could serve that purpose. Yes, sir.
You know the name of the cemetery he was buried in New York?
Marble Cemetery, and he was buried in the mausoleum of family friends. And again, I know the names, but I could look it up and find it. But yeah. So it's down in Lower Manhattan. Yes, ma'am.
Who had to agree to exhibit him in New York and bring him back? Was there a family issue there?
The family was certainly involved in it, and the man, in fact, standing here by the coffin is supposed to be his son-in-law, Sam Gouverneur. So the family was certainly involved in it. They would have certainly signed off on it. My sense is that Mrs. Monroe died in late 1829. Monroe's son-in-law, Eliza's husband, George Hay, died a couple days later. Eliza and James were living at Oak Hill. They decided to go to New York, where their daughter, where his other daughter Maria was living, and they were living with him. And Monroe fully intended to come back to Virginia, but he was in bad health, and after several months, he realized he was never going to be back to Virginia, that he would end his days in New York. But they placed him in they didn't buy a cemetery plot to bury him. They placed him in the mausoleum of a friend. And I'm not seeing this written any place to say it, but sort of the implication is there was always an intention to return the body to Virginia because it was not permanently interred, if you will. So the idea of the state of Virginia going to the family and saying we would like to bring the body back to Virginia, I suspect it's what they were planning, expecting all along. Yes, sir.
Oh, I just want to say that I wanted to congratulate you on catching the blue and buff on the map for Florida, as well as the reception of the Marquis de Lafayette.
Yes.
The blue and buff was definitely a key factor in the clothing, because at the time of the Revolutionary War, that was the commander-in-chief, and those generals that served him directly wore the blue and buff only.
Yes, and Monroe was on the staff of General Sterling as well. So as a senior staff officer, he would have would have wore a similar uniform. Yeah, Richard.
I was just wondering, I know so little about early 19th century portraiture, but for some of those portraits or group portraits where he looked so much older than he was, and most people just look kind of old, if that was really perhaps intentional by the artist, again, lend perhaps some gravitas, or again, state portraits just again tends to make people look older.
Yeah, I really don't know because in that painting of Washington's resignation, most of the people in the room were alive at the time Trumbull made that painting. So he certainly would have known, I mean, he would have known them, and he would know most of them anyway. But they were alive at the time. He certainly knew what they looked like. So possibly it was that, indeed, that it was trying to give it a bit of gravitas by and it's also interesting in that Jefferson is one of the few who's not wearing a powdered wig, and everybody else pretty much does, which they weren't doing, at that time in Congress. So again, it's this. So it may very much be what you're saying. It's a way of portraying them as being a more formal portraiture of trying to convey the gravitas of the ceremony. Yes, ma'am.
A guide at the cemetery in Richmond, Hollywood Cemetery in
Yes.
Richmond, told me that there was a concerted effort to bring tourists to Richmond. So they wanted to have this presidential circle. And of course, as we know, they moved John Tyler against his second wife's wishes from Sherwood Forest. But in cooperation with the family, because the Hughes family wanted him home, or the Gouverneurs, whoever was there, the Gouverneurs wanted him home, they brought Monroe, and they had plans to move Jefferson and Washington, or Madison, but of course they ran into a stone wall. So the idea was for everybody to come to Hollywood Cemetery and visit the presidents. I wanted to ask you, what date was the Gilbert Stuart and All in Red?
They're 1817, and the sketches and the bust were done. Monroe sat for them when he was in Boston in July 1817, and then Stuart made the sitting portrait based upon the bust that he had done from life. Yeah, and the cemetery business is very interesting because it's the whole period when cemeteries start coming into prominence, and they become, this is entirely different, whole lecture would be very interesting, where they become civic spaces. They're civic green spaces. So Mount Auburn in Boston is the first, I think. Is that Mount Auburn or is it Forest Park? One of them. Anyway, and it's basically, it's a public park. It's a cemetery, but it's this green space full of grass and trees and all sorts of things, and it's a resort for people in the city. And so the same idea with Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and it would be enhanced by having the burial sites of the great presidents. So, yes. Okay, how are we doing here? Okay, we can do one more here, I think. Yeah, Bill.
Is there any record over in France of the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, having his chroniclers or his artists capturing the Louisiana Purchase and maybe having an image of Monroe from the French perspective?
No, and I mean the images we have of that are much later. The bitter monument for St. Louis was 1904. It was for the centennial of it. The mural in Washington is 1890s. So these are commemorative works done in the United States commemorating the great Louisiana Purchase from our point of view. I mean, there was nothing contemporary done at the time. And I don't know that the French much want to commemorate the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, but there was some secrecy connected to the purchase too. I just remember that from the lunch.
This is, come back next year and we'll have another lecture on this. But very, very briefly, the problem was the French would never admit that they had actually acquired Louisiana from Spain until about a week before the American negotiations actually began. The United States kept asking, we hear that you have signed a treaty with Spain for getting Louisiana back, is this true? And the French would say, well, maybe, or we haven't heard about it, or something. They would not answer the question. And then finally they said, well, yeah, we do have it. And then about a week later they said, would you like to buy it? So that was the secrecy involved in it. Okay, yeah, we'll do Chris and then we're finished.
The Vanderlyn and Stewart modeling of Monroe's head are totally different. And you have the elongation of Vanderlyn, and the death mask looks more like the Stewart.
Yeah, it's more of a rounder face.
Yeah, I think it would be really good to
Yeah. But then you look at the Morse, and again, he has a longer face rather than a rounder face. So, yeah. And this raises the whole question of, sort of we think of Stewart and Vanderlyn and all as being sort of, among the best portrait painters of the time. But then the question comes up, sort of how skilled were they really at
the Morse picture, which also has this sort of round.
Yeah. But that always comes up, and if you look at the Gilbert Stuart portraits, if you look at a whole row of them together, you can see he pretty much had a formula for painting them, and he stuck a face in there, and
So the Morse is really the one thing.
yeah, and sort of how good of a painter was Morse? He was a respected portraiture, but again,
It was the most close.
yeah, but then the Monroe family and Monroe himself said, this looks like me more than any of the others.
Yeah.
But then, is that really saying very much? It looks more like me than something that doesn't. Yeah. So anyway, all right. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. We will resume here at what time is it now? It's at 11 o'clock for our next lecture, which is going to be very special. It's going to be a presentation by 3 of our students here at University of Mary Washington, talking about artifacts from the Monroe Museum. So please come back and hear their fine presentation. Thank you.